This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. Before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by HubSpot. When all marketers do is put out fires, you burn out fast. With Breeze, HubSpot's collection of AI tools, you can get results without the stress. So marketers, stay cool, and your campaign results get hotter than ever. Visit hubspot.com/marketers to learn more. Year Ahead is our Hit the Ground Running New Year podcast series where we chat to our friends in news about what they've got their eye on this year, and in true Squiz form, we get their recommendations. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Clare Kimball.
Clare Harvey is our guest this week to talk politics. She's the Editorial Director at the Australian newspaper, host of the Front podcast. Welcome, Clare.
Thanks for having me.
Clare, the reason we wanted to get you on the podcast is that there's a whole Harvey family thing when it comes to the Squiz, and it would be really rude of us to leave you off that.
I've been wondering when my invitation was going to come.
Exactly right. It was all too timely. But you're also someone that we've admired for a very long time for your journalistic chops, and we're also fans of your podcast. So really thrilled to have you here. It's quite a treat.
I know you guys have given the Front a shout out from time to time. I really appreciate it.
We have recommended it quite a bit.
Yeah.
We really enjoy it.
Oh, well, thank you.
I reckon we should get into the news.
Let's do it.
Let's start with some quick reflections from you on 2024. We asked you to have a think about what that might be. The rise of anti-Semitism in Australia was what you've cited to us as the biggest political theme of last year. Can I ask, I guess to start with, do you think there's a rise in anti-Semitism, or has it always been there? It's just sort of been really brought to the fore and more attention on it across the last year or so?
I think in Western society, anti-Semitism has been latent for thousands of years. And I think it's very easy to ignore. It's this thing that bubbles up to the surface every now and again. You know, as you read back through history, you read about Jews being expelled from the city of London in the Middle Ages in riots. You hear about, of course, pogroms in places like Russia. And I think since in my lifetime, it's been easy to kind of think that anti-Semitism was over, that the Holocaust was the end, you know, that the world learned its lesson. And I think that was kind of what I thought until October 7, 2023, when the Middle East conflict, which kind of bubbles away and, you know, many of us try not to pay too much attention to it because it's just endlessly distressing. When Hamas attacked Israel and murdered hundreds of civilians and took hundreds of hostages, I think that shocked many people, including many Jews here in Australia. Then the response to that from other people, including some Jewish people, was also extremely shocking. So I've had my eyes opened, I think, to the fact that anti-Semitism, which I've always understood to be bubbling away under the surface, at any moment can spring forth and be a really active, malign force in our society.
It's certainly front and centre, isn't it? In a way, I think you're right, that hasn't been in my lifetime either as a discussion point. And I guess if there's one good thing, if good's the right word for it, to come out of this, we're a lot more aware of the issues, whether it's anti-Semitism or whether it's the issues that have been happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think a lot of Jewish people around the world in the Jewish diaspora have been shocked by the fact that something that they might have thought was an issue for their grandparents or their great-grandparents is live now. You know, my Jewish friends have ranged in their reactions from, you know, from absolutely stunned that anyone would discriminate against them or anyone would assume that they're automatically on the side of Benjamin Netanyahu or that they automatically don't like Muslim people, to people who've kind of rolled their eyes and been a bit weary and been a bit kind of, I told you so, I told you it was always out there. So, yeah, I mean, here in Australia we've seen a Greens politician here in New South Wales suggest that Jews and the Zionist lobby, as she called it, have their tentacles in everything, you know, reviving this shocking trope from, you know, which should be consigned to history. We've had marches in the streets holding up signs with the Star of David being put into a rubbish bin. We've had graffiti on cars in Jewish suburbs. We've had the firebombing of a synagogue. It's really unbelievably alarming. And the people who were very concerned about Islamophobia a decade ago, in the wake of, say, the Lindt Cafe siege here in Sydney, there was a progressive sort of upsurge of concern about Islamophobia, which is great. Those very same people have been, in my view, the ones fanning this idea that Israel is evil, that believing in the idea of a Jewish state is evil, and that even that Jewish people are evil.
You sort of touched on the fact that it was surprising that to the public, I guess, broadly, that this is actually such a big deal. But then separately, there's also the leadership on the issue. And you've sort of alluded to the fact that the leadership on the issue has surprised you also.
Yeah. I mean, we all knew that this is something that's bubbled away on sort of ABC weekend news bulletins and the Labor left at annual conferences for the past 50 years. You know, it's
a frequent flyer, isn't it?
You know, whatever's the latest developments in Gaza or the West Bank has sort of been the feature of, you know, ABC News on the radio on the weekend whenever they don't have anything else to report. It's like it's something that that sort of well-meaning, concerned Australians have been kind of thinking about for a long time. Simultaneously, the Labor left tears itself apart about this issue at conference every year. And you know, fundamentally, the hard left's view is that Israel actually doesn't have a right to exist. And usually the sort of sensible forces in Labor manage to avoid any kind of condemnation of Israel coming out of Labor conference, which is so esoteric and so stupid when they're trying to get themselves elected. But it is this obsession. Now the Labor left is in power federally, and they have expressed that deep belief, I think, that Israel doesn't really deserve to exist, by confusion and missteps in policy ever since.
Do you think this is something that is consequential when it comes to an election? Like, looking forward, do you feel that this will be something people will make up their minds on how they vote?
Some people absolutely will, but that's a really interesting one. Like, how will that go? A friend of mine who is Muslim, who lives in one of the seats held by the Teals, tore up her membership to the Labor Party because she was outraged that Albanese hadn't done enough in support for Muslim Australians. You know, simultaneously, most of the Jewish Australians I know are extremely motivated about it, and many other people are kind of confused. Of course, it's not nearly as big a vote decider as the cost of living, even in those Western Sydney seats with a lot of Muslim voters that people talk about a lot. I think actually when they come to the ballot box, they're going to be voting about the fact that their kids can't afford a house and, you know, so on. But I think it adds to an impression, particularly after the Voice campaign, that this government doesn't clearly articulate what it stands for. Nobody really understands. Neither the Jews in Australia nor the Muslims in Australia feel that the government's on their side. And I think most other Australians would struggle to articulate exactly what the government's position is.
And what about the opposition's position? Do you think that's clearer?
Yes. I mean, I think Peter Dutton has, you know, at least partly for opportunistic reasons, made it extremely clear that he has wholehearted support of Israel. He is prepared to wear whatever cost that brings in say, Western Sydney seats. Whether that will help him or not, I don't know. I think he's seizing on the government's discomfort about it. You know, it's probably clever politics rather than anything else. Although I think there is in the coalition a very strong thread of support for Israel that, you know, is best articulated by people like Julie and Lisa. So, I do think it's clear. I was having a look at news poll figures actually earlier this week on qualities like decisiveness. I know what they stand for. Peter Dutton is ahead of Anthony Albanese. He's behind Anthony Albanese on things like likability and, seems like a good person. So, yeah, which of those are Australians going to... Do they vote for the person they like or the person who they think, you know, has a kind of strong line?
I feel like this is a really good time to take a quick break because we're getting into this year, and unfortunately, if you're not interested in listening to chat about elections, that is what the next part of this podcast will be about. Absolutely, no doubt, unavoidable.
It's the year ahead in politics. So
sorry, this is what it'll be. Here we go. A message now from HubSpot. When all your marketing team does is put out fires, you burn out fast. But with Breeze, HubSpot's suite of AI tools, you can get results without the stress. It means you can capture audience attention, access all your data from one place, and see how easy it is to get 110% more leads in just 12 months. Visit hubspot.com/marketers to learn more. Claire, when it comes to 2025, at least, as I said, the start of this year is going to be dominated by election talk. It's completely unavoidable. That's what's happening. We're having an election by May. I'm right, am I?
Middle of May, yep.
Yeah. I think first it's probably important to give people the lay of the land. So Anthony Albanese obviously is the Prime Minister. He won the election with a majority. He's got 78 seats, slim majority. You need 76 to win. Although does that change this time around? Do you need 75 with 150 to 151?
No, 76 for a majority.
Still need 76.
Hung
Great.
Parliament is 75. Yep.
76 is the number in your head. Consensus opinion seems to be that holding on to that could be really tricky. You said to us, though, before we came into the studio that you thought he could actually increase his majority.
I think what I was trying to say, not very articulately, was I think that's the big question of this year. Can a government which has not shot out the lights in its first term increase its majority? I'm sceptical about that. I don't think that they can. I think it's a question of how well the others do and whether the government is either capable of holding its majority, very slim, or if it doesn't, it's going to have to form a coalition with the Greens.
And this is where, like, following the story really helps, doesn't it, from the last election through to this one, because it's not just a simple equation between Labor and the coalition. Because of this really big group of independents and Teals that we have this time around, they're the most independents that we've ever had in the parliament, or cross-party MPs, as the case may be with the Greens. So then there's all these factors that we don't really have the ability to make a big brushstroke declaration about, because these are individual seats that are facing individual issues and very, very interesting personalities involved in those contests as well. So for the Albanese government to hang on and do, if it's heading down to minority sort of stakes, those deals, really, really tricky stuff.
Absolutely, and both sides of politics like to say they don't like identity politics. You know, they think of Australians as all kind of one united people. But come election time, they are thinking very carefully about Muslim voters, Chinese voters, Jewish voters. What they might think of as Teal voters, or what we might have once thought of as moderate Liberal.
Yeah,
voters.
And a Teal voter in Perth won't be the same as a Teal voter on the northern beaches of New South Wales, for example.
Yeah. The coalition has done a huge amount of work to try and win back the Chinese vote after Scott Morrison, annoyed China by being probably too blunt about his concerns about COVID. I think that the seats that the Teal seats where people once might have voted for a progressive Liberal like Malcolm Turnbull in the last election voted for Teal candidates, those are the seats like Wentworth in Sydney where there are a lot of Jewish people and then also a lot of progressive people who would think of themselves as progressive, who wear keffiyehs to the gym now. So those are going to be fascinating seats.
Yeah.
Can the Liberals get them back? Many of the progressive Liberals left Parliament at the last election because of those Teals who came and took their seats. Have the Teals done enough to impress anyone to get re-elected? Their big campaign was reforming sort of integrity in politics, the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. That was kind of the big thing. That hasn't done anything publicly impressive.
No. There's not been the big case or the big sort of scandal exposed, has there, through that process?
No. I mean, and maybe the NAC is going through very soberly, and carefully taking a long time to consider things, but that doesn't help the Teals much.
No.
Who would even know that it had actually been created? So, yeah, I think the Teals are coming back to this election and voters are going to be saying, well, what have you achieved? I don't know if they've achieved that much that they can talk about, that they can demonstrate a clear result. So that means, in those seats, it's going to be the Greens versus Liberal versus Labor versus the existing Teal candidates. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I tend to think those seats are actually Liberal seats. They're moderate Liberal seats for people who are rich, They don't really like paying a lot of tax, but their children are quite progressive and they need to kind of impress them with their progressive values. And so I think it's quite possible that those seats will go back to the Liberals.
It's interesting. I feel like there's sort of two, and I mean, again, 2-point identity politics, but there's sort of two cohorts of voters that are going to be a big part of the conversation with Peter Dutton. He needs 21. Like, he needs to win 21 seats to get a majority government. Like, it's a huge haul. It's huge. So that's just not Teals seats. There's 7 Teals, I think, in the parliament. So he'll need to be thinking about those seats. But then on the flip side, he'll need to be thinking about the other opposite end of the spectrum. And there's lots of commentary around about these battlers. So they were Howard's battlers. They're now people that are turning against the Labor government, the Labor governments of times gone by. They're the people that voted for Trump in the US, potentially. There's some comparisons being drawn there. So how does Dutton, I guess, address Teal voters that are higher socioeconomic, upper middle class, very values-driven potentially, and then also address people that are really, really struggling and cost of living being the thing that everyone's saying is the thing that's going to swing the election? How does he do both?
Oh, it's so hard, isn't it? I mean, Peter Dutton is positioning himself as the new John Howard, the friend of the battler. I heard Tony Abbott just this morning talking about voters on Struggle Street, which is...
that's a classic line, isn't it? Blast from the past.
Yeah, that's right. They're hoping that they can appeal to the kind of tradie, small business people, self-employed people who don't like what they would perceive as Labor favouring the public sector wage growth, more public servants, kind of people in their perception, the coalition is hoping, having a cushy life on the public teat. So, but the big issue is obviously going to be cost of living. And, Dutton will attempt to turn this into a referendum on inflation and the price of petrol and rent and groceries. That's very hard for Labor to win. Governments around the world have fallen because of this issue in the past couple of years. It was a big factor in Trump's return. The other thing I think about Trump is that it shows us that you can't assume that young voters are left-wing, whereas we might have assumed that 10 years ago, or at least more left-wing than their parents.
Yeah.
That's definitely not the case anymore.
And whether that's true here in Australia. But I do want to pick up on what you are saying about the public sector versus the private sector. There's a lot of commentary around there's been announcements made about out of the Commonwealth Public Service that, you don't have to come back to work. Actually, you can work from home. That's legislated now. Like that is the priority. They're getting pay increases that the private sector are just not seeing because of the economic situation we're in. Then, of course, if you do look at the US and you look at Elon Musk and you look at Trump and what they're doing with gutting the public service, do you think that is going to be a real consideration here and a fight that we're going to have here in Australia as well?
I think this is always something that comes up. The coalition makes a lot of noises about cutting public sector spending, public sector waste. That they haven't actually done that, I think, since the election of the Howard government. They came in and slashed public sector jobs at a federal level. Canberra was devastated. I know this as a resident of Canberra. At the time, Canberrans were shocked. And then it just slowly creeps back up again, and no one really does anything about it. It's about perception. And unfortunately for Anthony Albanese, a lot of that perception is going to be about things that have happened at the state level. So Labor governments are in power in the states. When a Labor government comes into power in the states, the union's like, great, we can get pay rises for nurses, teachers, cops. They go in hard. In places like New South Wales, they've won very big raises. Anyone who's got a child in a New South Wales public school will know that there are now, I think, 5 more student-free days as a result of the teachers' negotiations, which just pisses off parents.
Yeah, right.
So the consequences of those kinds of decisions that state governments make are felt by the federal government, of course. So that'll be Dutton's campaign.
There was one issue, far more specific issue that you raised, which I feel like we have ignored a little bit in the sense that we know it's a thing, but we haven't really understood it properly yet. And for that reason, probably a lot of people listening are like, yeah, salmon farming, it seems to be a thing
in Tasmania
that we're talking about. But like, why? But you actually have said to us, no, let's keep our eye on this.
Yeah.
Why? First maybe explain the issue.
Sure.
And then explain why, of all the things we could talk about today, salmon farming farming was what you want to talk about, Claire.
Well, wasn't the movie Salmon Farming in Yemen?
Yes.
It's like salmon farming in
There's nothing
Tasmania.
to do with that. I don't
Salmon
know.
fishing in Yemen.
So I'm going to sell this. I'm going to try and sell this, okay?
You wanted to talk about it.
We all
got
love salmon. I love salmon.
Love salmon.
Love eating it. And we love personality drama. So this is...
Tick, tick.
This is two former friends who now hate each other. And it's all about smoked salmon. So Anthony Albanese and Tanya Plibersek are both in the left faction of the Labor Party. And at university, they were kind of friendly colleagues, you know.
They're both New South Wales.
Both from New South Wales, both in the kind
city.
of inner
Yeah.
city. But they're in different parts of the left. And now they hate each other because when Albanese was elevated to the leadership, he started punishing Tanya Plibersek for basically having been on the opposite side of various little Labor Party scraps over the years, you know.
She's also someone who's been touted as leadership material too, isn't she?
She's glamorous, she's smart,
Yeah.
she's articulate, and she would have made a great Minister for Education, which is what she really wanted and what she thought she was going to get. But when Albanese became Prime Minister, he gave her instead the portfolio of the environment. Not climate change and the environment or, energy and the environment, which would have allowed her to be doing the big Labor government
That
things.
big debate, yeah.
Instead, just the environment, which means approving coal mines or rejecting them, in this case, approving salmon farms or rejecting them. So in Tasmania, there is this pristine and absolutely beautiful harbour, much bigger than Sydney Harbour, immense, called Macquarie Harbour. And it's where most of the salmon that we eat at the cafe or at the sushi train comes from. And, crystal clear, cold waters, and lurking at the bottom are about 40 of this particular endangered kind of stingray called a Maugean skate. And the environment movement, people in Tasmania, are extremely worried that the Maugean skate is going to become extinct because gigantic salmon farms, they keep the salmon in, huge pens, and that creates a huge amount of waste, obviously. Are killing off the Maugean skate and making the water dirty. So it's actually all very simple, but the reason it matters for the relationship between Albanese and Plibersek is that I think my interpretation of Tanya Plibersek's behaviour as Environment Minister is she's like, right, well, you made me Environment Minister. I'm going to take it really
Here we go.
seriously. I'm
Yeah.
going to reject some coal mines or gold mines that you think I should approve or that the government would like me to approve because it makes life easier for them. And now I'm going to create a problem with the salmon farms. Huge numbers of people in Tasmania rely on the salmon farms for their jobs.
It's thousands of jobs,
Absolutely
isn't it?
thousands of
Yeah.
jobs. It's a huge undertaking in Tasmania, and their reputation, the industry is based on a reputation for clean, green, beautiful, fresh Australian produce. She has agreed to review the existing licences for the salmon farms and also make new inquiries into whether salmon farming can continue to go on in Macquarie Harbour. That is going to potentially lose Labor 3 seats in Tasmania, which it cannot afford to lose. And so now Anthony Albanese has directly intervened. So he has been flying to Tasmania, he's been meeting with salmon farmers, he's been promising to get this issue solved. That is potentially extremely humiliating for Tanya Plibersek, who's already been humiliated by him in Parliament over negotiations with the Greens about other things. It's a personality clash, and it potentially means that if we buy salmon in the future, we're going to have to buy it from somewhere else.
The
Where else would
drama,
we get
Claire.
it?
You've sold it so
I know.
well.
It's fascinating.
I'm in.
It is fascinating. And I mean, I also think you articulated so well that this is about that relationship too, that Albanese-Plibersek relationship that you read about in the news and you go, what is this? What is going on here?
Yeah.
And that snippet that you've just given
What
us
it's
really
about.
sums it up.
He gave her this job of bringing in something called nature-positive legislation, which is something that left-wing governments all around the world want to do. It's like we're going to take the climate into consideration before we approve anything in future. She got this close, negotiations with the Greens and crossbenchers, and then he pulled the rug out from under her feet just before Parliament rose at the end of 2024, completely humiliating her. So And that's where these issues are really quite interesting too. Tassie sort of has form on these kind of issues, doesn't it? Like 2004, Mark Latham, forestry,
Absolutely.
John Howard flies in. It's a whole thing if you want to Google it. It was quite an interesting chapter in that election. It's hard to believe Mark Latham was the federal opposition leader, wasn't it? It could have been our Prime Minister. However, things have changed and
we're back to issues around the environment and Tasmania and Labor committing, it feels like against their instincts, against their sort of higher instincts to protect the environment. And you've got a Prime Minister saying, no, I'm standing with jobs and I'm standing with big multinational companies that want to farm here.
That's right. And like, who really cares if 40 of these Maugean skates never exist anymore because no one's ever seen one?
What's a skate?
And Tassie swings.
Can you eat it?
We all know this from our...
You need
from
the votes.
Like, that is a state that does change its mind about who they vote for.
Absolutely.
Well, I feel like we probably should have talked about Elon Musk sooner, but we can't not talk about Elon Musk. What did you want to say about Elon Musk? I guess because I don't think 3 years ago any of us thought Elon Musk would be someone we'd be like, he's going to be a big deal when it comes to politics in Australia.
I guess I just can't wait for him to start chiming in on Australian politics because it's going to be so interesting. I mean, look, in the past, week or so, he has declared that Nigel Farage, what I would have said is a far-right leader in the United Kingdom, is not right-wing enough. And in fact, his party Reform should bring in someone who's more right-wing than him. He's got views on the German election, on France, every election that's going on around the world. Elon Musk is chiming in basically saying, please be more right-wing, be more anti-immigrant. We know that he has a big influence, obviously, on the Trump administration. Australia needs a good relationship with the Trump administration if we're going to have the AUKUS treaty that, we're supposedly having. But immigration here in Australia is such a delicate issue for elections. I have no doubt Elon Musk will start chiming in with some views about that very soon, and I'm looking forward to it.
Do you think he is influential, like here as far as voters?
No.
Because he's got, there's like the business influence. You can get into Starlink and, what Telstra's deal with them and how he's actually helping us make sure we can all talk to each other. But there's that, and then there's sort of his political influence, and then there's the fact that he owns a social media company.
Yeah.
Do you think he is influential in what he says for voters?
I think Donald Trump thinks he's influential with young male voters, and maybe that turned out to be true in the United States election. Whether that's so much the case here, I kind of doubt. I don't think young men here in Australia are that motivated about the kind of issues that he's interested in, free markets and free speech and so on. I think his influence is on politicians. I think the idea of having, a story running for 3 weeks with Elon Musk firing pot shots at you is not something any politician really wants. So,
and it's the chaos he can create.
Exactly.
And knocking you off what it is that you want to do. All of a sudden you're answering questions all day about Elon Musk.
Exactly.
Just to play devil's advocate, if you're a member of the public that isn't a journalist or a politician, are you just going, can the media stop reporting on it if it's not a big, like, why are we talking, why are the three of us sitting here talking about it if it's not actually that big of a deal? It's just pot shots, and why are we all consumed by it? Is there a little bit of that fatigue?
Probably. Isn't that the story of the election overall? It's like, shut up about the Maugean skate.
Can you talk about the things I care about?
Afford a house.
True, but I think the Maugean skate is a thing people care, because it is like the salmon farming issue isn't something that obviously the masses care about, but people really, really care about it in those 3 seats or whatever.
Absolutely.
So that's quite different to sort of just annoying interjections from someone, who is very high profile. But then it becomes influential because the media obsess about it and talk about it, and then it's sort of self-fulfilling in that way.
He's also terrifyingly articulate and the richest person who has ever lived. So it's hard for us to ignore his opinions. It's entertaining at the very least, And I think the fact that Trump is elevating him to such a sort of senior position in his government, as far as we can tell so far, until they break up, which no doubt they will, means that what he says does actually matter. He will have an influence on US policy, at least until Trump sacks him.
Which, who knows how long it'll last. We will find
it's
out.
Fascinating, isn't it? Claire, just talking about how people can get information about the election, what's your advice about how to actually navigate this very tricky territory?
And I guess that question comes from, you're sitting here and you're going, well, Elon Musk has put this on X, and does that matter? And then the commentary comes off the back of that. Like, is that what we should pay attention to? Or, and then there's also the added conversation around social media and, disinformation and what's actually appearing on our feeds. Like, Would you recommend people just avoid the scroll altogether? Or what's sort of your advice? Because our audience certainly are people who want to feel like they're getting trusted information in an informed way, and they want to think about that when they vote.
Yeah.
What's your advice, I guess?
Pay for journalism. The only way to get information that is actually curated and assessed and analysed for you by someone who's taken the time is to spend, $1 a week or, $5 a month on a subscription to a news outlet like the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian Financial Review, the Canberra Times, the Hobart Mercury, wherever you live.
And they're not News Corp owned paper. Like, you're giving a plug to any media.
Yeah.
Like, whatever your preference is.
Yeah.
Pay $8
Professional.
a month for the New York Times. Social media is not a place to get information that has been fact-checked or verified.
Well, we certainly pay for all of those.
Indeed,
don't we, Claire?
absolutely, and more.
Couldn't agree more. Your recommendation, though, is completely unrelated to the news. Let's have it.
Yeah, and this is something that you do have to pay for, because we're all used to paying for streaming services, right? Nobody objects. Wolf Hall, the blockbuster television, BBC One, I think, show, which for the first time really took Henry VIII seriously. Instead of portraying the Tudors and Henry VIII as sort of this kind of hilarious cavalcade of 6 wives, half of whom got their heads cut off, this is actually a beautiful analysis of power and how power corrupts, based on the double Booker Award-winning novels by Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light, and Bring Up the Bodies. The initial series of Wolf Hall came out 10 years ago.
That was a while ago,
Damien Lewis and Mark Rylance, and Claire Foy, before she played the Queen in The Crown, as Anne Boleyn. This is the second season, and it's about the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, this very intelligent, wily political advisor with an instinct for survival. So you guys will love it.
Oh, yeah. I still haven't read the books. I'm like, they're on I was supposed to read them on my first mat leave and my second mat leave, and I'm about to be on my third mat leave. So maybe I'll read them on my
What
third
is
mat
it about
leave.
changing nappies and dealing with a baby that makes you think you can read
Exactly.
this
What a
massive
stupid
doorstop of
idea.
books? I mean,
Terrible idea. That's why it hasn't happened yet. But you've read 2 of them.
I've read 2 of the 2.5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
they're not easy reads.
They're not easy reads, but it's so compelling.
Yeah. I think they're like a lot of big doorstopper books. They're easier to read once you've seen the TV show.
Yeah, right.
Okay,
You
that's
can
interesting.
Imagine
Yeah.
you can sort out who's who, and you've got a visual image of to keep it all sort of straight in your head.
Well, that's why I say 2.5, because I found the third one really hard to really stick with. So maybe this is the way to get that finished.
But the second season of Wolf Hall, which is called The Mirror and the Light, is going to have a much more diverse cast. So this is where, diversity in casting, colourblind casting, has been sort of bubbling away. You sort of see a black person appear in sort of medieval Italy, and it's like, interesting. Then Bridgerton and Hamilton.
Yeah, that explosion.
Happened and showed us all that you can have a black person playing George Washington or Lady Whistledown, and it's actually okay. It's about who can bring this character to life the best. So the second season of Wolf Hall will see courtiers in the Tudor court in the 1500s in England played by people of colour. So I can't wait to see how they've handled it. Yeah.
So how do people get that? That's BBC. You have to subscribe. You have to pay for it?
Yes, you do. BBC? It's on Apple TV, I believe.
Right.
We'll check that.
So first season's out, second season is coming.
Excellent.
Yes.
We'll put a link to that in people's episode notes. Claire, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been really fun.
It's been great.
For more from us at The Squiz, make sure you hit follow on your podcast app. On Saturdays, Claire and I host a podcast called The Weekly Wrap. It's the week in news and what's coming up. Perfect to keep up with the news in 30 minutes each week. Across January, other year ahead episodes feature guests on entertainment, on fashion and on business. We reckon it's the year to be informed, not overwhelmed, and the best place to achieve that is with The Squiz.